Okay, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to do about the writing process, and then we'll have a separate video, a concept video about the plagiarism assignment, and then we will have a separate video for the tech and science communication. The description lecture is already posted, as well as the critical reading and writing PowerPoint lecture. So the writing process itself, we've learned about it as having steps: pre-writing, drafting, revision, and editing. But the big thing is that it is not a flow chart. It is recursive. You're going to spend time in each of these, and obviously the more time that you spend in each step individually, the less you have to go back to the previous steps. But sometimes you do as much as you can, and you still have to go back between them. So for example, if I do a lot of outlining and research and get everything I need in the pre-writing stage, my drafting stage will be a little bit easier. However, sometimes when I'm drafting, I realize, oh, I need a little bit more, or maybe I don't have enough of something, or I want to change something up. So you got to go back to the pre-writing stage. Same thing when we're in the revision stage, we're thinking about what do we need to change, what do we need to add, what do we need to cut. We might have to go back to the drafting and or the pre-writing stage in order to fix things. Editing, we're mostly focusing on grammar, word choice, and formatting issues. So as I said, pre-writing, we're going to be brainstorming about the topic, preparing to write, figuring out, what are we going to write about, what topic? Is it narrow enough that we can write a paper on based on the size paper that we're planning on? Or is it broad enough that we can write enough to get to that full paper? And do we have a thesis to guide how we're going to write? When we're drafting, we're just writing down the thoughts into complete sentences. I like to call this the word vomit stage because we're just trying to get all of our ideas onto paper, and we'll talk more about that. Then the revising and editing, you can see, are two actually different steps. So in revising, we're looking at what's written and deciding, like I said before, what to add, cut, or change. This is making sure we have everything that supports the thesis. We have topic sentences. We have enough support for each paragraph. We have enough sentences. We have enough length to the paper. The editing is where we review writing for grammatical mistakes, word choices, formatting issues, basically the little ideas. Now, editing is important because it can change the meaning of what we say, but it's not as important as, say, the revising stage, making sure everything's there, the meat of what we're trying to say, such as in revising and drafting. So first at the pre-writing stage, this is where we're developing our ideas. The first step to that is picking a topic. We want to make sure it's narrow enough, but not too narrow. A narrow topic that's too narrow might be good to write a paragraph on, but not enough that can be written for a whole paper. But a broad topic has too many bases to cover in the size paper you're doing. And it completely depends on what size paper. My master's thesis was about 53 pages. So, and that's pretty common, over 50 pages for a master's thesis. So you could, if you're doing one in history, for example, you could probably talk about all of the causes and effects of World War II. But if you're doing a 1,000-word essay, which is about 3 pages, you're probably only going to be able to cover the top 3 causes or the top 3 effects, or 1 or 2 causes, 1 or 2 effects. It just depends on how much you have to write about. So we have to narrow the topic a little bit. So some techniques that we use to help us figure out what we're going to write about are brainstorming, journaling, rewriting, and clustering. So these techniques, brainstorming is we're sitting down, we're making a list of topics that come to mind. What do we want to write about? If we already have a broad topic that we've been assigned, what could we break it down into? If we don't have a topic, where are we going to get started? Such as our research paper is going to be open choice. So you want to start now thinking about, well, what are possible ideas possible topics that I could write about, and then you can start to think about narrowing them. Free writing is when we set a timer, say for 5 minutes, and we write every thought that comes into our head about the topic that we are thinking about, or anything related to the topic. And it doesn't even have to be completely related. It could be something that is only tangentially related, but it still gets us the idea down. Then, after the timer goes off, we can reread what we've written and we might find a topic among writing. It might give us some unique topics that, other people might not write about. It might give us something that we know a lot about that we can, something that pops up a lot in our writing. So, there are a lot of different ways where this is helpful. Journaling is very similar to free writing, but you don't have that time limit, which can give too much pressure sometimes to think about, like, oh my God, here's a topic. What do I actually know about it? Oh my God, the timer's going off. So it allows you to make notes about the topic and the ideas just without the pressure of the timing. You can still use the same techniques of free writing where you write down everything in your head about a topic, anything related to the topic, but it gives you a little bit more freedom. You can organize it a little bit better. Clustering is kind of the standard that we've been taught, where you start with a main topic in kind of like a bubble format, and then you branch it out into smaller parts, and then those into smaller parts until you find a topic that is manageable for the paper. So I have some examples of that here. If we were writing a paper on animals, that's our topic. So brainstorming, there are cats, dogs, rats, mice, fish. I have the note that you could talk about saltwater versus freshwater fish, birds of prey versus songbirds. But you can see it's just a very basic list of different things. Obviously, I could list other types, right here, I've just listed examples of animals. I could list pets versus wild animals. I could list domestic animals versus wild animals. There's a lot of different things I could write about in this list, but it's still very much a list format. Here's an example of free writing and kind of journaling. So this is just kind of something that I wrote just, in a few minutes. Animals are pretty awesome. So that's, my opinion. So that shows that, I could write a paper being persuasive of why animals are great. That's a great topic there. There's a huge variety. I could talk about biodiversity there and how many different kinds of animals there are. There are dogs, cats, mice, rats, birds, fish, snakes, and reptiles, and many more species. You can see, just like my brainstorming list, I've kind of listed out the different animals that I can think of that come to mind. Most of these can be used as pets. Birds are pets, but only certain birds. So you can see here, I'm starting to think about how these animals play a part in human lives. So that could lead to a topic of how do animals and humans work together? How have humans domesticated animals? What has that process been like in different time periods compared to now? We keep, songbirds usually as pets. Some people still do hawking and have birds of prey as pets. Some people still have peacocks as pets, but it was more common during ancient times to have peacocks as pets. So you could go many different ways just from that idea. Fish of all kinds can be pets, dogs can be pets or service animals. So now we could talk about, everyone talks about dog being man's best friend and what they're like as a good pet, but you could do something different and talk about what they're like as a service animal. Cats are aloof, they're only good as pets. Cats, depending on your experience with them, I had some cats that I didn't train them, but they were able to detect when my blood sugar was low. So you could use that and say, well, maybe they're not trainable as service animals or maybe in your experience, they're just aloof and they're not friendly. Maybe someone else's experience is they're really friendly. You want to contradict that statement. So you have a lot of different things from that sentence. Mice and rats and snakes are not considered popular pets, but they might make good pets. So that's an interesting topic. The fact that people sometimes have exotic pets. How is that different? Whether they're taking care of them, the requirements for them, things like that. Some people eat snakes. That sounds gross. You can see this one is a very tangential idea. It's still kind of where the other ideas are topic wise. And to me, that sounds gross, but in different cultures, different animals are eaten. There are cultures where bugs are fried, and there are cultures that, we even have not even cultural based, but like things like sushi, things like pork in some religious section, denominations, pork is considered off limits. So, people, their relationship with animals and food. We have veganism and vegetarianism. So you could go off of it's still related to animals, but it might be an interesting paper rather than what everybody does. Now, if you really want to do a paper on why dogs are the best or cats are the best, something that everybody does, that's fine. That's a good paper too. But sometimes if you have a chance to write something unique, a unique perspective on something, not just what everyone else says, that's where you can start to develop your voice and your unique ideas as a writer. All right, and this is an example of clustering. So you see I broke down, if I had a bubble version, it would be animals in the middle, broken off into birds, into fish, into mammals, into reptiles. Fish is broken down into saltwater versus freshwater. Birds, I've broken down more into hunting birds, songbirds, and tropical birds. Hunting birds, then I give example, eagles, hawks, and osprey. Songbirds, robins, mockingbirds, and starlings. Tropical birds, macaws, parrots, and birds of paradise. Then macaws are broken down into scarlet, blue, and gold, and Hans, which Hans is one of my birds. So if I were writing a paper, what I really like about the clustering technique personally is that if I get stuck, if I start to break something down, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write a paper on Hans macaws, and I find information, and I'm able to write 3 paragraphs, maybe about their feeding behavior, how long they live, and a description of them. Cool, I've got a full paper from them. If it's not quite enough, though, say I was supposed to do a 5-page paper instead of a 3-page, and I only get 3 pages out of it. What I like about clustering is I can go back up the cluster bubbles and see, okay, well, if I don't have enough to talk more about Hans macaws, maybe I write a paper about macaws in general, and then I write a paragraph about scarlet macaws, or a couple of paragraphs about scarlet macaws on feeding, description, and lifespan. Same for blue and gold, a couple of paragraphs on the same topics. Same for Hans, a couple of paragraphs on the same topics. Now I've got my 5 or 6 page paper. It helps expand by going back along that cluster. Or if I need to narrow it further, I can keep narrowing it further. So I personally really like the clustering, but you can see all of these techniques have some really great usages to them that can help you figure out what you want to do for a topic. So this, if we were in the classroom, we would practice with this topic, but it's just to show you can do it with any topic. I picked animals just because that's a love of mine. But if we wanted to do art, you could start by branching, well, what types of art? We could go by time period. We could go by specialization, like Rococo art versus neoclassical art. We could go from break it down by paintings versus photography versus sculpting. We could break it down by digital art versus physical art. There are many different ways you can break things down. Even then, using free writing, you can write, what do you know about art? What is something you could write about? Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind, because I just talked about digital art, first thing I would write about in free writing is how digital art is becoming more popular. AI generated art is starting to take over. There are many problems with AI generated art. And you could see there are multiple things right there that I could write about in a paper. And that's just a couple of sentences in a few seconds popping out of my head. Same thing we could do with history. You could break it down by time period, by country, by culture. Literature, we could break down by time period, by genre, by type of literature. science by type of science, and then even within the type of sciences, like physical versus life science. Then you have under life science, you have biology and chemistry, and you have all kinds of different sciences. And then even within biology, you have those who do more just, human biology versus animal biology. Then do they focus on discovering new species, describing current species, conservation? There are lots of different ways we can break these topics down. So once we've figured out what topic we're going to be doing, we need to develop our thesis statement. So this is going to be the last 1 to 2 sentences of our introduction paragraph. So our introduction, you're going to have your hook as the first sentence to try to grab the reader's attention. This could be done by a quote that everybody knows that's somehow related to your topic, an interesting statistic or fact. It could be anecdote, which is a small story that's somehow related to what you're going to be discussing. But all of that should funnel into our thesis statement, which is our roadmap for ourselves as we're trying to develop the paper, but it's also a roadmap for our readers. When a reader sees the thesis, they should be able to tell what your topic is, what your purpose is going to be, and where you're going to go in the paper. Now, for us, it's also one of the most changeable parts of the paper. So if I start with a thesis statement and I start writing and I end up not writing exactly what the thesis statement is, then I can change the thesis statement to match what my writing is instead of, rewriting the whole thing to match the thesis statement. But in the end, a thesis statement will help guide us as we're writing, as well as be a roadmap in the final version for our readers. So these are some tips about creating thesis statements. The first thing is that when you have a question that, what do I want to know about a topic? So maybe I want to know more about the demographics of middle-class Americans. You can't leave it as a question in your paper because that puts the responsibility on the reader to have to answer the question, when in reality, the responsibility is of your paper to answer the question. So I would just turn that question into a statement. The demographics of middle-class Americans are 1, 2, 3. Then I've given, my reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. And then by doing that, your audience knows you're going to be discussing the demographics of middle-class Americans. You're being informative, you're being objective about it, just giving the facts, and you're saying it's this, this, and this. And I should know by 1, 2, 3, your first body paragraph will discuss 1. Your second body paragraph will discuss 2. Third will discuss 3. You also need to make sure with your thesis statement that you're telling your audience why, but don't give away the whole point. You don't want to, start explaining what you're going to talk about in the body of the paper, the meat of your ideas, but you need to give enough why this is important so that way they want to keep reading. So something like tattoos are a visual form of self-expression and not all of them are bad. Well, most people these days have the attitude that they are visual self-expression, that they're not bad. So what do you have to add to that particular conversation? Why are you choosing this? So if you just say, well, tattoos are a visual form of self-expression, not all of them are bad, why? What more are you adding to this conversation? You also want to make sure it's narrowed enough of a topic, but again, that you don't give away what you're going to talk about, but you at least explain what you're going to talk about. So if I have the mind is primary, the body is a secondary result, that's good, but I don't know what topic you're going to be talking about. If I just add the words in health, now I know you're going to talk about in healthcare or in someone's health. The mind is primary, the body is a secondary result. That lets me know you're probably going to be talking about how mental health care is crucial to take care of first before physical healthcare because one influences the other. Now, you can have a very simple thesis statement, or like I said, it can be 2 to 3 sentences max and be a little more complex. The key thing is that the more complex a thesis statement, you have to cover everything that's in that thesis statement in your paper. So sometimes simple is a little bit easier. So an example of a simple one would be high school sports can benefit students physically, emotionally, and mentally. I know from reading this that the paper is going to be about high school sports, that the writer is going to convince me why they're beneficial to students in the areas of body paragraph 1, physical benefits, body paragraph 2, emotional benefits, and body paragraph 3, mental benefits. Pretty simple, pretty easy. The other key thing you'll notice about this statement and the next one is it doesn't announce in this paper I will discuss. We don't want to make our thesis statement an announcement because it's boring. We want to just get straight to the point. With a more complex statement, you can see here what's going to be covered. So the first sentence says, many people know about the damage that Katrina caused to New Orleans, but many do not know how much it actually cost to clean up. So from that sentence, I know that their first goal of the paper is to take what people already know and contradict what they know and give us new information, specifically in the area of the cost to clean up. From the second sentence, I learn what areas am I going to be learning about in cost. So there was property damage that insurance has to pay for. So I know that's a cost that will be discussed in paragraph 1. Businesses that have to rebuild and clean up, so that's a cost that will be discussed in paragraph 2, and economics products such as oil and crops that were affected by the storm, body paragraph 3. So you can see sometimes when we have a complicated idea, it might need to be separated into 1 to 2 sentences rather than just all one sentence running on, but we still need to cover everything that's going to be in the thesis. You're really not going to have more than 2 sentences for a thesis for the majority of papers as an undergraduate student because you're going to be having shorter papers. You don't have to cover a lot of ground. All right. So once we've done all that in the pre-writing stage, we get to the drafting stage, or like I said before, the word vomit stage. This is where we are kind of outlining, okay, these are the ideas we want to do. What are the details we want to add to it? We might create a physical outline. And I know some people might think, well, that's a waste of time. Why don't I just start writing? I used to think that too. But the beauty of an outline is that it helps to organize your thoughts ahead of time. And the more you do an outline, the more you can fill it in and start to flesh out what you're going to do for your paper. And we'll discuss outlines when we get to the research paper, but it can be very helpful to help guide what you're doing. So when you're drafting the first draft is never going to be good, no matter what level writer, even professional writers. Ernest Hemingway always said that the first draft of anything is going to be crap. It's just the way it is. So you really don't want your first draft to be the only draft that you have to turn in. That's why we have the editing and revision stages. That's why we, all teachers say, don't leave it to the last minute to do, because you're going to have a lower grade. It's not going to be as good writing as if you had the time to reread it a second time to get that revision stage in. The problem is when we try to make our first draft our only draft is where we start to get into writer's block. So the reason why we get this block is because we end up, instead of just worrying about getting our ideas on paper, we decide, well, we have to get everything done at once. Everything has to be perfect. We have to get everything done in order. So a few things to help with that. One of them is not to start with the introduction. Start with the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are what support your thesis. They're what you have information about from your pre-writing, whether you've done research or it's something that doesn't require research. You have the information. Start with those body paragraphs, fill them out with your ideas. It's the same way that if you meet a brand new person, you know nothing about them, you can't then introduce them to someone else because you know nothing about them. In the same way, if you haven't written the body of the paper, how do you know what you need for background information to introduce what you're going to talk about in the paper if you don't know what you're going to talk about yet? So start by what you do know what you're going to talk about, the body, and you don't have to be like, oh, I have to finish this body paragraph. If you get stuck, bounce to the next body paragraph. Bounce between the different paragraphs as you need to. As long as the final draft has them all filled out, at least 5 sentences minimum, and they all support the thesis, they all make sense, they have that topic sentence, support sentences, conclusion, analysis sentences, everything that you need. It doesn't matter what order you do it in. It doesn't matter if you complete one before moving to the next. Like I said, just get your words, your ideas down. Also, the more you spend time thinking, well, I have to make this perfect, I have to revise while I'm writing, I have to edit while I'm writing because this is the only draft, then you end up sitting there agonizing over making something perfect that you lose your train of thoughts and it dries up and then you get into writer's block. So just use the drafting phase to get those ideas on paper. And another key thing is that the 5 paragraphs that we're told, 5 paragraphs minimum for an essay, this is a guideline. I like to think of them more as sections. You have the introduction section, the body section, and the conclusion section. Now, yes, you do want a minimum of 1 paragraph for the introduction, 1 paragraph for the conclusion. And if you're not doing a very long paper, then that should be all that you need, is that 1 paragraph. Obviously, if you're doing a much longer paper, like for master's work and stuff like that, you might need a few more paragraphs in order to introduce the topic that you're doing, leading into what we're going to be talking about, then some introductory background information. Your introduction section might be a little bit longer. But for short papers, 1 paragraph should be plenty. For the body paragraph section, the body section, we say 3 paragraphs because the whole point is we want to support the thesis. 2 is the bare minimum. You need at least 2 to support your thesis. 3 would be better, but obviously, again, if you just rely on the 5 paragraph structure, you're going to have ideas all combining into each other. You need to make sure that every topic, or every body paragraph is focused on one topic that supports the thesis. So if you have 2 topics in the same paragraph, split them. You can have 4 body paragraphs. You can have 5 body paragraphs, 6 body paragraphs, anything you need to get the topics across, and then just change the thesis to match the order of what you've written and what everything is to match. The last part, once we've done our drafting stage, this is when we get to our revision and editing stage. So this is where we really need to focus, in the revision stage at least, on making sure that everything is there that needs to be there. If we have our thesis, we've said that high school sports can benefit students physically, emotionally, and mentally. Have we done our body paragraphs in that order? If we haven't, we need to change the thesis. If we haven't written enough to support the thesis, or maybe we've added something that wasn't in the thesis before, we could change the thesis. We could write more to support the thesis. We want to make sure our topic sentences are there, our support and analysis, our conclusion, the paper is long enough. This is a great time to do peer review because our brain knows how the ideas are supposed to fit together. We know what it's supposed to say. So sometimes when you reread something, even when you slow down and read it aloud, it sounds great in your head because you know what it's supposed to be doing. Your brain will fill in even if there's something missing. But having someone else read over your paper, they can start to catch, oh, wait a minute, I kind of see what you mean here, but I don't see how everything's linked to each other. Then that advice, no, okay, now I got to make that more clear for my reader in that section. Or maybe I do really well at this, but I need to work on this. That way you have someone else to double check your paper. And a lot of people do peer review across all levels of writing. Even, like I said, professional writers in academia. That's why we have editors for books and for articles. That's why we have peer review if you're going to be submitting any type of article for academia. It has to go through a peer review process where people in the same level as you will double check the paper to make sure, does it make sense? Is your argument supported? Does it have what it's supposed to have? Then with the editing stage, this is where we start to worry about grammatical mistakes, format mistakes, uh, word choices, vocabulary. And again, not that this is like, oh my God, the most important, if I miss a comma, it's going to kill someone. It's not. And, but I do like to use an example of how it changes what we mean. There was a case in Maine where there was a list of jobs that were not allowed to be paid overtime. And in the list, it was shipping, comma, handling and receiving, which you can do. But if they had put shipping, comma, handling, comma, and receiving, then we would know that anyone who works in shipping, anyone who works in handling, and or anyone who works in receiving does not get paid overtime. But the way that it was written, it could be interpreted that anyone who works in shipping and or anyone who works in handling and receiving, so not handling and then receiving, but has both in their title, they're the ones who don't get overtime. But anyone who has handling in their title without receiving, or receiving in their title without handling, should get paid overtime. And because it could be interpreted that way, people in the case against the state of Maine won $5 million. Now, not every comma is going to be worth $5 million, not every word choice, but, and again, we're logical beings. I had a paper once as a tutor, a nursing practical, and I logically knew that what she was trying to say was trying to help the patient. But the way she had it worded sounded like she wanted to kill the patient. It can change the meaning, even though we're logical beings and we know what you meant. It's better to be careful with your writing, and you're not going to pick it up while you're drafting. It takes a lot of practice to know what grammar thinks. Even professional writers make grammatical mistakes while they're drafting. That's why we have the editing phase to double check through everything. And a great example of this too, I like to show about word choice is important as well, because, sometimes, we rely on, especially in a digital world, we rely on Microsoft Word spell check or Grammarly or any of these things. And it might be spelled correctly, but not be the word that you meant. It also, our word choice matters because we have denotation, which is the dictionary definition of a word, but then we also have connotation, which is the emotional and cultural associations of the word. So two words might mean exactly the same thing according to the dictionary. They're synonyms. You think, well, why can't I use one in place of the other? Because the connotation changes the meaning of what you're trying to say. So my two favorite examples, one of them is childish versus childlike. They both mean exactly the same thing according to the dictionary, that a person is acting like a child. But if you tell someone we're being childish, it's automatically negative. Whereas if you say, wow, they're so childlike, it could be neutral, but a lot of times it's more positive. The same thing, the dog barked. Well, dogs will bark about anything. So it's very neutral in how it could be. The minute you say the person barked, unless you say the person barked with laughter or barked out laughter or something like that, it's automatically negative. I think of my dad in the army, the drill sergeant barking out orders. it's automatically that person is shouting, and it's a much different image in your head than a dog maybe yipping and barking happily. So we want to make sure we're using the best words that we have. All right, and the last part that I want to talk about is writing frames. So these that we've talked about are the general process of writing an essay. What we're going to do for the rest of the class is we're going to talk about writing frames. So there's the personal essays. We're going to talk first about descriptive. Next week, we'll talk about narrative. Then we're going to talk about process analysis essays, compare and contrast essays, cause and effect essays, and our research paper is going to be an informative essay that kind of combines the other four types of essay techniques. And these are more, how do we frame the final essay? What are basically the different types of essays that we might write? Persuasion and argumentation are more going to be learned about in Comp 2, ENC 1102. But the idea is that a persuasive essay means you have an opinion, you are giving that opinion, and you want someone else to agree with your opinion, but it's based solely on opinion. Argument is where you have a point of view, a side which you stand for. You have facts to back up your side of your argument. And you're not necessarily, your goal isn't to get other people to agree with your argument or your side of your argument, I should say, but just that your argument is legitimate and well supported. This is very important, especially if you have to take, say, Introduction to Literature, Lit 1000 through Polk State. That one you're going to be doing literary arguments. In those types of essays, it doesn't matter whether I agree with your interpretation of the literature or not. It's more, does the literature support the argument you're trying to make? That I could say, yes, that is definitely one way to interpret the literature, or no, it's not. So, like I said, persuasion and argument, you'll learn more about how to do in Comp 2 and in literature, but we're going to be focusing on the others. So I hope that helps with the writing process. With connection to this PowerPoint and the critical reading and writing process PowerPoint, you have the writing process discussion. You're going to answer a couple of questions about what was your writing, or what is currently your writing process. Have you used any of the steps, any of the techniques that I've discussed in these two different PowerPoints? If not, which ones do you think might help you in this class and going forward? If so, which ones have you used and how have they helped you? And then you're going to make that post by Sunday night. And then by Monday night, try to make the responses to other students so that way you can, add to the conversation. So not just, I agree with you, or yeah, I use those too, or oh yeah, that's interesting. You want to add to the conversation in some way. So try to think about what your classmate has said. How could you add to the conversation, expand upon it? It doesn't have to be necessarily contradictory to what they said. It could still be agreeing with what they said, but go beyond, I agree with you. I hope that helps, and I will see you all again soon.